There is exactly one book in the entire Bible that never mentions God's name, not a single time, from its opening line to its final verse. It is also one of the most dramatic rescue stories in all of Scripture, hinging on a queen risking execution just to walk into a room uninvited, and a king's sleepless night that arrives at precisely the moment an entire nation's survival depends on it. The book is Esther, and the complete absence of God's name from its pages is the detail almost no retelling of this story ever stops to explain. Everyone knows the basic shape of Esther's story. A young Jewish woman becomes queen of Persia without revealing her heritage. An official named Haman plots to exterminate the Jewish people out of wounded pride, and Esther risks her life to expose the plot and save her people, becoming the reason the festival of Purim exists to this day. It's a genuinely thrilling narrative, full of court intrigue, reversal, and a satisfying dramatic resolution. But most retellings treat the story as a straightforward tale of a brave woman's courage, without pausing on the single strangest literary fact about the book that contains it, that in a story overflowing with what looks unmistakably like divine intervention, the author never once names the god who appears to be orchestrating it. The story begins in the court of King Ahasuerus, generally identified with the Persian king Xerxes, who ruled an empire stretching from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in total. During a lavish banquet displaying the full wealth of his kingdom for 180 days, followed by a further 7-day feast for everyone present in the citadel of Susa, the king commanded his queen, Vashti, to appear before his guests wearing her royal crown, wanting to display her beauty to the assembled officials. Vashti refused, an act of defiance that, in the political culture of the Persian court, could not simply be overlooked, since the king's advisors feared that word of a queen disobeying her husband might spread throughout the empire and encourage every wife in the kingdom to treat their own husbands with similar contempt. Vashti was deposed, stripped of her royal position by formal decree, and a search began for a new queen, with beautiful young women gathered from across the empire brought to the palace to be considered, each undergoing a lengthy period of beauty treatments before ever appearing before the king. Among the women gathered was Esther, a young Jewish orphan raised by her older cousin Mordecai after the death of both her parents. Mordecai instructed her not to reveal her Jewish identity or her family background, a piece of advice she followed carefully throughout the entire process that eventually led to her being chosen as the new queen, favored immediately by the eunuch in charge of the harem and eventually winning the king's favor above every other woman brought before him. Meanwhile, Mordecai himself sat daily at the king's gate, close enough to court affairs to hear what was said and done there, and it was in that position that he happened to overhear 2 of the king's officers, guards of the threshold, plotting to assassinate Ahasuerus. Mordecai reported the plot through Esther. The conspiracy was investigated and confirmed, and the 2 men were executed on the gallows. The event, along with Mordecai's role in exposing it, was recorded in the official chronicles of the kingdom, a detail that seems minor and administrative at the time it's mentioned, easily forgotten in the middle of a much larger unfolding story, but which becomes one of the most important hinges in the entire book later on. Some time after this, the king promoted a man named Haman above all his other officials, and commanded that everyone at the king's gate should bow down and pay homage to him. Mordecai refused day after day, despite the king's servants at the gate repeatedly questioning why he alone disobeyed the royal command. The text doesn't fully explain his reasoning, though it may have been connected to his Jewish identity and a refusal to grant the kind of homage that bordered on worship to any human official. Whatever the exact reason, Haman was filled with fury when he learned of it, and decided that killing Mordecai alone wasn't a sufficient response to the insult. Instead, having learned of Mordecai's people, Haman resolved to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire Persian Empire, a genocidal ambition born out of a single man's wounded pride over one person's refusal to bow. Haman cast lots, called pur in the local language, the origin of the name Purim, to determine the most auspicious date for this planned massacre, and then went to the king with a calculated argument, describing a certain people scattered throughout the kingdom whose laws were different from everyone else's, and who did not keep the king's laws, and offering an enormous sum of silver, 10,000 talents, into the royal treasury in exchange for permission to destroy them. The king, without investigating further or asking for any specifics about which people Haman meant, gave Haman his signet ring and full authority to proceed however he saw fit, telling him to keep the silver and do with the people whatever seemed good to him. A written decree went out to every province in the empire, in every language spoken there, authorizing the annihilation of all Jews, young and old, women, and children on a single specified day nearly a year later, with their possessions to be plundered as spoils. The city of Susa itself, we're told, was thrown into confusion by the decree, even as the king and Haman sat down to drink together, apparently untroubled by what had just been set in motion. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, mourning publicly at the entrance to the king's gate, along with Jews throughout every province where the edict had been proclaimed. Esther, still queen but not yet aware of the full scope of what Haman had orchestrated, sent clothes to Mordecai to replace his sackcloth, unaware of exactly why he was mourning so visibly. When she finally learned the details through her attendants, Mordecai sent word urging her to go to the king personally and plead for her people. Esther's response reveals exactly how dangerous this request actually was. She reminded Mordecai that anyone, man or woman, who approached the king in the inner court without being summoned faced a single, uniform penalty: death, unless the king specifically extended his golden scepter as a sign of mercy. And there was no guarantee that gesture would come. To make matters worse, she had not been called to appear before the king in 30 days, a detail that suggests her standing with him may have already been uncertain, perhaps fading, making an unsummoned appearance an even riskier gamble than it would have been for a queen whose favor was secure. Most people telling this story remember that Esther eventually agreed to approach the king. Almost no one pauses on exactly how real and immediate the danger actually was, or on the single strangest fact about the entire book surrounding her decision: that nowhere in this story does anyone ever explicitly call on God, pray to him by name, or credit him directly for anything that happens. This is exactly the kind of detail Untold Bible Stories exists to slow down, for the part of a famous rescue story that almost never gets its proper weight. Stay with me, because this absence changes how the entire story actually works. Mordecai's message back to Esther, urging her toward this dangerous decision, contains the closest the entire book ever comes to naming God directly. And even this comes only in the form of a question rather than a statement. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Notice the careful indirection in this statement. Mordecai expresses confidence that deliverance will come from somewhere, without specifying its source. He suggests Esther's position might have a larger purpose, without stating outright that this purpose was assigned by God. Throughout the entire book, this pattern repeats. Events that look, from any reasonable outside perspective, like clear divine orchestration, described instead in the language of circumstance, timing, and possibility. Esther's response to Mordecai includes one specific detail worth noting. She asked him to gather all the Jews in the capital city and fast on her behalf for 3 days, neither eating nor drinking, and she and her attendants would do the same. Fasting in this culture and era was almost universally connected to prayer and seeking divine favor, even though the text once again never explicitly states that Esther or anyone else prayed during this fast, or names who exactly they were fasting toward. The action implies far more than the narration ever states outright. After the 3 days, Esther put on her royal robes and approached the inner court of the palace, standing where the king could see her. When Ahasuerus saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, the immediate danger of her unsummoned entrance passing in a single, silent gesture. The king asked what she wanted, promising to grant even up to half his kingdom if that was what she requested. Rather than immediately exposing Haman's plot, Esther made a request that seems, on the surface, almost anticlimactic given the stakes. She simply invited the king and Haman to a private banquet she had prepared. At that first banquet, when the king again asked what she truly wanted, Esther deferred a second time, inviting them both to yet another banquet the following day, where she promised to finally answer his question. This delay, unexplained in the text beyond Esther's own timing, becomes one of the most consequential decisions in the entire story, though its full significance doesn't become clear until the events of that single night in between. That night, unable to sleep, King Ahasuerus commanded that the book of the Chronicles be brought and read to him. This detail arrives with no explanation attached to it at all, no reason given for the insomnia, no indication that anything specific troubled him, no hint from the narrator that this particular night was different from any other night in any deliberate way. He simply couldn't sleep and asked for the royal records to be read aloud, likely as a mundane remedy for restlessness rather than any conscious search for something specific, the kind of small, unremarkable request a wealthy, powerful man might make on any ordinary sleepless night without ever suspecting it would alter the fate of an entire people by morning. The passage that happened to be read that night recorded how Mordecai had exposed the assassination plot against the king years earlier, the very event mentioned almost in passing at the beginning of the story, easy for a casual reader to have forgotten entirely by this point in the narrative, and apparently forgotten by the palace itself in all the time since. The king asked what honor or dignity had been given to Mordecai for this service, and was told that nothing had ever been done for him. No reward, no recognition, the debt simply left unpaid and apparently forgotten by everyone, until this exact, sleepless night brought it back to the king's attention, out of the thousands of pages of royal record that could have been selected to read that night instead. At that very moment, Haman happened to be arriving in the outer court, coming early to ask the king's permission to have Mordecai hanged on gallows he had already built specifically for that purpose the previous evening, 75 feet high, a public execution meant to finally settle his grievance before the day was even over. The timing here deserves real attention. Haman arrives at the palace at the precise hour the king has just finished learning about an unpaid debt to the very man Haman intends to execute, a coincidence so exact that it would strain credibility in almost any other kind of story, let alone one claiming to record actual historical events. The king asked Haman what should be done for a man the king wishes to honor. Haman, assuming with characteristic vanity that he himself must be the intended recipient of this honor, suggested an elaborate public display. Royal robes the king himself had worn, a horse the king himself had ridden, led through the city, square by one of the king's most noble officials, proclaiming before the man's face that this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. The king agreed completely, and then delivered the instruction that must have landed on Haman like a physical blow. Take the robes and the horse exactly as you have described, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Haman was forced to personally dress Mordecai in royal robes, walk him through the city on the king's own horse, and proclaim publicly the exact honor he had designed for himself, before returning home in humiliation and grief, only to be summoned almost immediately to the second banquet Esther had prepared. At that banquet, when the king asked a third time what Esther truly wanted, she finally answered directly, her own life and the lives of her people, who had been sold for destruction by a decree she now revealed had come from the very man sitting at the table with them. The king, enraged, discovered Haman pleading for his life at Esther's feet, and one of his attendants happened to mention the gallows Haman had built the night before for Mordecai, still standing in his courtyard. The king ordered Haman hanged on the exact gallows he had built for the man he had just been forced to publicly honor. Look back over this entire sequence and notice how many separate elements had to align with almost impossible precision for this reversal to happen at all. A king's random insomnia, on the one specific night that mattered most. The random selection of exactly the chronicle passage recording Mordecai's forgotten service. Haman's arrival at the palace at the exact hour that revelation had just concluded. The gallows Haman had already built, standing ready and waiting to be repurposed for an entirely different execution than the one he'd planned. Esther's own decision to delay her request by one additional day, a delay that placed her final banquet on the precise day after the king's sleepless night rather than before it, allowing Mordecai's honor to be settled before Haman's downfall was ever exposed. Remove any single one of these details, or shift its timing even slightly, and the entire sequence unravels. And yet, through every single one of these turns, the text describes each event in purely circumstantial terms: a king who couldn't sleep, a chronicle read at random, an official who happened to arrive early, a gallows that happened to already be standing. No angel appears. No voice speaks from heaven. No prophet delivers a direct word explaining what's happening or why. The entire reversal unfolds through nothing but timing, memory, and coincidence, described in language that never once credits any of it explicitly to God, even as the cumulative effect of so many precisely aligned details makes any purely random explanation increasingly difficult to accept, the more closely a person examines it. This is likely the exact reason. The Book of Esther has puzzled and fascinated readers for centuries, in a way few other biblical books do. Some ancient Jewish communities reportedly hesitated over whether to include Esther in the canon at all, partly because of this very absence of God's name, a hesitation that ultimately gave way to the book's inclusion, precisely because its message about providence didn't require explicit divine language to be unmistakably present in the pattern of events themselves. The theology of the book operates entirely through implication, through Mordecai's careful, indirect confidence that deliverance would come from somewhere, through the sheer improbability of the timing that saves an entire people, through the quiet suggestion that Esther's specific position might exist for a specific purpose without anyone ever stating plainly who assigned that purpose to her. Subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, because what this deliberate silence actually accomplishes, what it does to a reader that a direct statement of divine intervention never could, is the part of Esther's story most retellings never think to explain at all. There's a particular kind of persuasion available to a story that refuses to explain itself directly, one that a story naming God's intervention outright simply cannot achieve in the same way. When Scripture states plainly that God parted a sea, or sent fire from heaven, or spoke audibly from a burning bush, the reader receives the miracle as already interpreted, already labeled, already understood as unambiguous divine action. Esther offers something different, a sequence of events a skeptical reader could, in isolated moments, attribute to nothing more than coincidence and human timing, and yet a sequence that becomes progressively harder to dismiss as mere chance, the longer and more carefully a person sits with how many separate details had to align without a single explicit miracle ever occurring. The book essentially invites its reader to do the theological work Mordecai himself only half articulates, to look at an unbroken chain of remarkable timing and draw their own conclusion about what or who might actually be behind it. This has made Esther, across centuries of Jewish and Christian reading alike, one of the most quietly powerful arguments in all of Scripture for a particular kind of providence, not the loud, unmistakable, sea-parting kind of divine action, but the quiet kind that hides inside sleepless nights, random, chronicle readings, gallows built for one purpose and used for another, and a queen's decision to wait one extra day before finally speaking the truth she'd been carrying the whole time. For anyone whose own life has never included a burning bush or a parted sea, but has included moments of timing too precise to fully explain away as coincidence, a phone call that arrived at exactly the right moment, a delay that turned out to prevent disaster, a chance encounter that changed everything that came after it. Esther's entire structure suggests that this quieter, unnamed kind of providence might be the more common way it actually shows up in an ordinary life, then and now alike. The festival of Purim, established at the end of the book to commemorate this reversal, is itself named after the very lots Haman cast to determine the date of destruction, a permanent yearly reminder built around the mechanism of chance itself, deliberately repurposed into a celebration of deliverance. Every year the festival is kept, Jewish communities read the book of Esther aloud in its entirety, and, by long tradition, the audience is encouraged to boo and stamp and rattle noisemakers every time Haman's name is spoken, turning the story's villain into an occasion for communal, almost theatrical defiance, a yearly reenactment of exactly how thoroughly his plot ultimately failed. If you want the parts of these stories other channels never slow down enough to tell, subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, a new story like this one, every week. And next time, we're staying with a servant who refused to eat the king's food for reasons that had nothing to do with the taste of it at all.